Hey guys, so today I want to talk about how to do custom fireworks from within Fusion. Now there's a number of different ways you can approach this. There's a recent video posted by CBSuper. He uses an external program that has a bunch of different fireworks presets that look pretty good, and he brings them in and he shows how you can use some tracking to sort of bring it in and composite with an existing scene. So I'll link that here now. I advise you to check that one out as well. What this video is going to be focused on is doing everything from within Resolve itself. So let's jump right in. So here we are in Fusion, and here's the entire node structure. And what I'll do is just sort of do a quick overview, and then we'll go into each of these blocks and we'll get into some more details. So down at the bottom here, you see this reference section here. So let's just forget about this for now. It's not really attached up to my main node structure, but it did help me in terms of getting the look that I was going for. So we'll come back to that in a second. So this chunk up here is what's defining the actual fireworks. So up to the top here, I have the outer fireworks. I'll show you what that means in a second. In here I have the inner fireworks, and I have this little background, which is just some sort of smoke in the background that would have been left from previous fireworks that kind of gets illuminated as this new firework goes off. And over here I have a number of forces. I have some turbulence, I have some friction, and then I have a directional force that's kind of my gravity in this instance. Over here I have all my camera and renderer section here. So I have my camera, my 3D camera node, my render node here, and my 3D render node, because this is all in 3D. And over here I have a section what's called post, and that's where I just put on anything that's coming after this render node. So that's my glow, I got some directional blur, I have some just regular old blur, I have a bit of camera shake, and I have some film grain as well. So let's dive into these blocks a little bit more and see what each of them do. So let's come up here and take a look. And first I'm just going to show you what this reference section here is all about. So I'm going to grab this ref2_48. Well, what does that really mean? So what that is here, this is a reference image that I just did a screen grab of the source video that I was kind of modeling this firework after. So in terms of this naming convention, so ref, I have this number 2, that means that's 2 seconds in, and _48. And 48 is the frame that would correspond to this 2 seconds, because I'm at 24 frames per second right now. And the reason I did that is I kind of wanted to get a sense of how long things kind of take, because there's a whole bunch of different phases for this particular firework explosion. So I wanted to have a sort of a good, yardsticks along the way to sort of help keep me on track. And so, for example, if I were to take this media out node over here and bring it up here, I happen to be set up at frame 49, so close enough to 48. But then you can kind of see that things look a little bit similar here. And I'm not using this reference to get everything completely exact. There's some things that I've done that I think that I like a little bit better. There's some things that I didn't quite get right, and I'll be sort of talking about those as we go through. Okay, so I've set this up to frame 66 right now, so this is sort of early on in the life of this particular firework, but we can kind of see all the different elements here. So what I'm going to do is I'll keep this up at the top here, and I'm going to just talk through some of these boxes here, and I'm just going to kind of make a mapping just before we really dig into all the details of these, just to get so everyone has a sense of what all these things do. So what you'll see is a very heavy use of emitter nodes. There's 6 or 7 emitter nodes that I have in here. They're all serving a different function. Some of them are just pure emitter nodes. Some of them are spawn nodes, and I'll go through those and make the distinction once we get to each of them. So this very top section here, which I call outer fireworks. So that's this whole section on the outside. So ignore this sort of ball, this glowing ball in the middle here. And we start off here with this very first emitter here, and this is what I call the trail heads. So I've essentially set up this trail head here. It blows out these particles in every single direction. Those particles are invisible. Those particles, if you were to make them visible, are at the sort of head of each of these things here. Let's just go into our inspector. So I've just opened up the size controls for this trailhead, just to go through this a little bit. And one of the important things that I've set up here is the size over life. And you'll notice at the size over life, it starts off as absolutely nothing. That's why you can't see anything. But sort of halfway through its life, I kind of pump it up a little bit. And what that is, if I go sort of towards the end, that's each of these sparkles that you see here. So if you can just picture at the tip of each of these trails, there's this invisible particle. And as that particle travels out from the center position here, it's using this outer trails here to drop particles off as it goes, and that's what gives this effect right here. This trail noise here, this is a fast noise node. There's a tutorial that I'll link above right now that I did on smoke and steam, and it really goes into detail on how this actually works. So I'd suggest to take a peek at that. Okay, so there's the outer fireworks, then the inner fireworks here. So there's the inner trailheads, which is what I'm calling them. So just in terms of terminology, I would call this a trail here. right at the tip would be a trail head. So if you look at this section in the middle here, there's no trails per se. If you look sort of really closely, all I have is just the actual trail heads. So they're not really dragging anything behind them. All these trails that you see in the background are really part of this outer ring here. Then I also have this inner glow, and this is another emitter node. This is an emitter node as well, but this here is an emitter node that's just emitting a single particle that's this size here, this big sort of red chunk in the middle. So if I were to take that inner glow and just turn it off, just keep your eye on the color right here. It's going to take a minute to render, and you see that color sort of go away. So we're going to want to put that back on. And there we go. Down here is this background. So what I've done is I've taken another fast noise down here with this trail noise _1. I piped it into this background glow, which is another P emitter. And that is essentially just a bunch of large particles in this background that I'm just assigning a color to and putting some animations just to sort of coincide with the timing of this inner explosion here. So from looking at the reference video, you know, the colors on the outer ring are sort of mostly sort of yellow, orangey kind of colors. This very bright red explosion in the middle only lasts for sort of the first little bit of the life of the firework. And it's that inner blast that really seems to illuminate the existing smoke from some previous fireworks. So that's what this background section does here. Number of merge nodes. And so from forces on down the chain, just forget about that for now. We're going to get into that in a bit more detail. I'm going to have a bit more of a simplified version because anytime I make any changes to this here, it kind of chokes my computer a little bit. You'll notice that the initial shell trail in the animation at the opening is not included here. I have that done as a separate composition. There's some pros and there's some cons to that, and I'll talk about those sort of at the end of the video. I kind of do a bit of a post-mortem of some of the things specifically that I think I kind of got wrong on this, and I would like to sort of improve, but we can get into that a bit later. So if I just go back right to the start, not much happening here. Just a very bright glow. We'll come up to sort of frame 20 or something, and we see sort of the very early phase of this fireworks. And what I'll do is I'll bring up maybe these reference nodes here just so we can kind of compare. So this here, ref 1, 24, so that's at frame 24. So we're sort of close to frame 24 here. So, you know, not quite exact. One of the details that I didn't put in is this little smoke trail here from the shell. That's a really nice little thing that would add a good chunk of realism, but I didn't put that in. So you know what? I'm turning this off here because I'm just going to concentrate on the things that I didn't get right. That's not healthy. Okay, so we come a little bit further on. This is kind of the main show of the fireworks. We see this illuminated background. I probably could have pumped that up a little bit more to make it a little bit more dramatic. Coming up to frame 155, the inner glow is gone now, and we sort of see these outer trails just sort of slowly falling off. Continues to do so. Get up a little bit further, and those trails are now turning into this sort of sparkling, and those sparkles sort of continue and sort of fade out over time. That's kind of the life cycle of this whole thing. Okay, so I simplified things a little bit here just to make things a bit easier to go through. So right now I just want to focus on this outer firework part. So I've turned off the inner fireworks here, I've turned off the background, and I have just a couple of these post-processing options enabled. So I've also taken this trail heads here. This is the original version here. I've just made a copy of it here because I made a bunch of changes just so you can kind of see these the actual trailheads now. So this particular emitter here is responsible for these white dots here. So that's what I mean by they're sort of invisible before. Right now I just cranked up the size just so we can see them. And then again, the outer trails here is responsible for the actual trail. So first let's take a look at this trail heads here. And the first thing we want to look at is the number. So there's a couple different ways you can do this, but essentially what I want to do is on the very first frame, or the 0th frame, I just want to blast out a whole bunch of these particles. It's a one-time deal. I just want to blast them all out at once. So this code here allows me to do that. So if you haven't seen any expressions before, this is just sort of as simple as it gets in terms of expressions, and it's pretty easy to follow. So this IIF is really an if statement, and what it really means is if the time is equivalent to 0, so that means if we're on frame 0, output 100 particles. If it's not on frame 0, just do nothing. So the very first frame, or the 0th frame, it's going to do all this particle emission, and then it's going to just sort of lie dormant as far as producing new particles. Now I do have a lifespan set up. I have it set up to 350, so that's roughly how long I want things to last, but I have a very large lifespan variance. And the reason I have that variance is because at the end of the animation, there's those sparkling particles, and I just sort of played with this value till I got something that looked like a sort of natural fall off in terms of time for this sort of firework to die off. So I came up with 200. And again, I'm not going to go through all these options here in detail. I just want to really go over the highlights of sort of what I was thinking. You can take a look in the description. I'll link the composition below that you can download, and you can play with this yourself. So this here is really sort of the essence of, sort of the 3D fireworks explosion. I'll put our 2-up display here, and now you can see as I rotate the camera around, this is sort of full 3D here. So we're coming from this point source in the middle. I have my region set up to a sphere, but it's a sphere with no size, so it's essentially a point source right in the middle here. And I have my velocity set to this 0.425. So again, these values are all kind of relative to each other, right? So once you sort of choose one of these values, a lot of the other stuff, like your directional forces and that type of stuff, will kind of have to sort of map onto this. So I adjusted these numbers just to sort of feel right, but not necessarily to match physics in a sense. So one of the things you'll notice, I did not choose to put any velocity variance on, and the reason I did that is because, and you can kind of see it here. One of the problems that I was having with this particle emitter is it's not really that evenly distributed, and I played around with things a little bit, but I kind of wanted things to look a little bit more evenly distributed, and I'll show you what I mean when I look at one of these reference photos here. So let's take a look. I'll keep this one up here, and I'll take a look at a reference at frame 120, let's say. And you'll look at so this is my real reference photo here. So this looks very evenly distributed. It looks really nice, whereas mine looks a little bit more chaotic. So that wasn't something I did on purpose. That's something I actually could not figure out how to sort of have things distribute a little bit more evenly. So if anyone does have a method for that, please let me know in the comments. I would certainly appreciate that. In any case here, okay, so we spawn our particles here. We have our velocity set here. We're not using any variance. We have angle variance and a Z variance here. So these here, I've set my angle variance up to 360. So what I'll do to show how that sort of works, if we look sort of dead on from our camera, this is our X direction here, and this is our Y direction here. So this rectangle you see here is the XY plane, and then the Z is sort of in and out of the screen. So I'm going to take off the Z variance right now, just to sort of show how this sort of works. We see our rendering here, and this here is what's going to give me the 360-degree variance in the XY plane. And again, this one really highlights here the sort of non-uniformity. And you can always come up to this reseed here, and you can kind of play with these seed values here. Just re-rendering, and you're going to get a little bit of a different look. So if you ever just kind of, something just doesn't seem right, you have something kind of covering something else up or whatever, this is a handy one to sort of randomize things. So this angle variance here gets us the 360 degrees in this direction, and now we want to make it spherical. So if we look at this side on, it's going to kind of spin us around this way. So I'm going to set up 180 degrees, because if you picture this circle sort of rotating 180 degrees, it'll kind of fill itself in as far as a full sphere. If you were to put 360 degrees here, which you certainly could, that's kind of almost making two spheres that are overlapping in some sense. So 180 is good enough, and we push 180, it renders, and there we go. So that's how we get our spherical ball. So that's really at the heart of our fireworks. Rotation, spin, I have nothing there, because remember, these particles are invisible, so they're spherical anyway. I have the style set up to an n-gon, and I'm just using this soft circular. So I have this fade in. I think I was probably just playing around with that. I don't really think that matters too much, because we're kind of exploding into life. There's so much going on that this isn't really going to be very noticeable. And you'll notice I have this out set to 1. And that's because I don't want these things to fade out at the end. I want them to kind of sparkle out, and I don't do that sparkling in this here. That's what this here is used for here. And we'll get to that in a second. So merge controls, blur controls, not using anything down here. Color, I've just set it to sort of a very light gray. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move this copy out, and I'm going to move the original back in. And the reason I'm going to move that back in is because I just want to show you how those trail heads sort of work over life. So if you look, let me go into the size here. So if I come down here, the size I set up to be pretty small, and I have a little bit of size variance on there. And then I have this size over life down here. So for the first half of its life, it's doing nothing, and then it abruptly sort of turns on and starts to sparkle. There we go. We can see some of the sparkles start to happen. Okay, we're going to come back to the sparkles in a minute, but let's take a look at the outer trails here. So I'm just going to cover these trails very briefly, because I've gone over these before in some different videos that I'll link now. But effectively, this fast noise control, I'm just going to play this over life. And so without going into too much detail, each of these trails, if you were to really zoom in and look, each of these little particles that's being emitted is one of these effectively. And I've changed the color and stuff, but okay, so now let's take a look at our outer trails. So this outer trails works very closely with this fast noise here. So if you take a look at our outer trails and we go up here to style, we notice this is set to bitmap, and I have the bitmap as trail underscore noise. So this right up here. And then there's this animate here versus particle birth time. And again, I don't want to get into details here because I've gone into a tremendous amount of detail on this on another video that I'll link right here. Very worthwhile checking out that tutorial if you really want a good understanding of how these trails work essentially. Okay, so let's go over the outer trails a little bit. First, let me go back to the trailheads. I forgot to talk about sets. And again, I have another tutorial that's just based on sets, and we'll go through all that in detail. But what I've done effectively is each of the emitters is going to be assigned a different set. So right now I have this first emitter here called set number 1. And here's an example of how sets really work. So I'll come down to this directional force here. I'm going to click on that directional force, and up here I come up to this conditions tab, and down here I see this set mode, and it says affect specified sets, and I only have it to set number 1. So what that means is anything that's defined as set number 1, which is this trailheads here, is set number 1, this directional force is going to apply to. So if I come up and look at these outer trails here, and I come click on sets, it's set to set number 2. But I could have put another directional force node in and set it up to only look at set number 2, for example. So let me just give you an example here. So if I click on directional force and I were to come up here and I were to click on the set 2, what that means is because outer trails is set number 2, it's going to start pulling these down. So just sort of pick one of these to look at as I click on set 2, and we're going to render. These are going to drop. So it's almost rendered, and there we go. Okay, so back to our outer trails here. So I'm using the same kind of logic here, but instead of saying just a times 0, throw out a bunch of particles, I'm saying if it's less than frame 300, spit out 1 particle per frame. And the lifespan of each of those particles I've set up to 120 and 20. And these values I just kind of played with to get the right length of trail. If I found if this was sort of too long, things would look a bit too busy. Everything would just be overblown and bright. So these are just some numbers that I ended up getting to with some fiddling. So that's really is all there is for this section here. We come down to the style, and we've set this up to the bitmap with the trail noise. And if we come down here to color, so I've set up color over life. So what I did is I have another reference image down here, a trail reference. Let me just bring that up. And I really just sampled these colors. You can use this color picker here to kind of come up and just, pick whatever color you want. And you can sort of push these sliders back and forth to kind of vary the color how you want it. What I was really going for is sort of early on in the life, I wanted sort of a bit more white sort of out front. And towards the end of its life, we just sort of see this dying sort of orangey color, and it sort of fades out. And that's what you see here as we sort of fade out over life. And so if you come down and look at the size control, so I have a couple different things going on. I have a size over life, and I also have this size sort of over time. So here's the spline editor with a size control here. I have this animated, and then I also have this size over life. So these two kind of work in conjunction. And again, I just really was playing with these values, trying to shape the trails how I wanted to, using my references as a guide. Okay, so now let's take a look at the sparkle node here. So the sparkle node here, again, is to do the little sparkles at the end of these trailheads here on this outer firework. So what I did is I used a pCustom node here, and there's a lot of power in this custom node, and we're using it for fairly simple purposes. And this should sort of give you a bit of a flavor of what's possible with this custom node. But essentially what we want to do is, if we come up here to this particle node, there's all these different parameters for a particular particle. So we have our position, we have our velocity, and so on and so on. And down here we have red, green, and blue. These are the ones that we're actually going to mess with. So everything else is set to its default value. But these three here I changed to I1. And what does I1 mean? Well, I1 is simply, if you go over here to this intermediate section here, you have intermediate 1, intermediate 2. This is referred to I1, I2, I3, I4. So basically I can just write a small little macro in a sense in here, and I can just sort of call it later. It just saves me from rewriting this 3 times inside of the RGB. And the reason I kept these all the same is because whenever RGB values are the same, you're going to get something in grayscale. And so I didn't want any colors to be introduced. Let's just move this ahead so we can actually see some. So the code I use here is the ID, and the ID refers to a particular particle ID. So every particle that's emitted in the system is going to have some ID number. So what I did is I took that ID number, because I want all the particles to behave uniquely from one another. So one way to do that is to include this ID in this formula here. That's going to make it unique than any other particle. Then I take ID, I multiply it by time, so we're going to be looking at the different frame value, and then I use this modulo operator and a random number between 0 and 256. And I was just sort of playing around with these numbers to get something that sort of flat flickered on and off as I wanted it to. Okay, so that's all the outer fireworks. Let's take a look at the inner fireworks here. So if I come into the inner fireworks, we're going to turn on the inner trailhead. So I'm back to frame 70, and the way I've set up this animation is this inner fireworks ends a lot faster than sort of the outer fireworks. So we'll turn on this inner trailheads. Okay, so there we go. So the inner trailheads, and remember what I said at the start of the video, there's no trails on this inner part per se. So now we take a look up here at our number, and you'll look at everything here refers to trailheads, which is this one back here. That's our outer fireworks. So I've taken the trailheads number and I've multiplied it by 2. So we're going to have twice as many of the inner particles as we are the outer particles. We are going to look at the velocity, and we're going to divide it by 1.7. So I wanted the velocity to be a bit slower for these inner particles, so they were going to create a smaller sphere. So that's sort of what you see here. And I just sort of tinkered with that value until I got something that I was happy with. And the two angle variances here are set to the same as well. So it pretty much behaves the same way as this outer trailhead. Where it's a little bit different is just what the particles look like. So now these don't have trails associated with them. They're visible in themselves. I've set them up to be blobs. If you look down here, I have this color over life. So they start off to be very, very white. And then it sort of fades out to sort of be red at the end. And then what I did to complement this, because these are sort of implied red, a red color, is I took this inner glow. And what this inner glow is, let me just turn this on, it's a single particle that sort of looks just like that. And so that big red blob is what the inner glow is. And what I did to create this one, in number, so I'm using that same code before, so if time equals 0, only emit one particle. So this particle here is just going to be a single particle. So this thing isn't really doing much. There's nothing really set up down here. I won't go through these things. I've set it up to, oh, interesting. Okay, so I did set this up to be set 1, it looks like. So that will be affected by these forces over here. And that kind of makes sense. So this glow will be pulled down as the rest of the particles are kind of pulled down. So that's probably why I did that. As far as style, it's a blob. And I have some color over life here, sort of white to red, because at the start of the explosion, things are going to be white hot and cool off in a sense. Then I come down to these size controls. Here's my size over life curve. So I have this increasing over life. So that's really all this inner glow is. Then we're going to go over here to this background glow. So let's turn on the background glow, and I'm going to turn on the noise as well. So I'm using this this fast noise here in the very same way as I was using the fast noise for these outer trails over here. So let me just take this noise. I've played with the parameters a little bit, as you can see here. And what I do in this background glow, if we're to look at our camera, this rectangle here is where these particles are going to be emitted from. That's where the actual firework explosion is. So in behind, I basically have this sort of window of smoke. And you can kind of see, it's a little bit hard to see, but you can kind of see that faint sort of red sort of mist. I have this set up as set number 7. I have them set to bitmap because I'm piping in this fast noise here. And there it is right there. That's trail noise _1. Does change its color over life from black to sort of its reddest when explosion is kind of at its most dramatic, and then it fades back off to black. And I have a fairly large size, and I've set it up here using our same code here. If time is less than 10, spit out 1 particle. So that's for 10 frames, just doing 1 particle. So there's going to be 10 total particles. So they're fairly large, and they just kind of blur within each other. They're not really moving too much. It's a very quick effect. It's just really something that you just want to see briefly as we go sort of through this most dramatic phase of the explosion. So that's it for the actual fireworks part. So we bring the outer, the inner, and the background, we merge them all together, and then we go on to our forces here. Let's take a look through these one by one. Let's take a look first at our turbulence. So our turbulence here is going to affect set 1, and I have our trail heads here set to set 1. I have our inner trail heads also to set 1, and our inner glow set up to set 1. And this effect is very, very subtle. I have an increasing strength over life. I was just sort of playing around with this value. It's something that I could probably turn it off and you wouldn't even notice, but in any case, I have it in there just for a little bit of a subtle effect. One of the things that I didn't do that would give a bit of a different effect is if you take a, let me just turn off this inner glow. That's a bit. So now I'm going to expand that a little bit. I'm going to come up to our turbulence here, and I am going to go to our sets, and I'm going to turn this on for set number 2. So set number 2, remember, is these actual trails here. So take a look at these trails when I turn on number 2. It gives it a bit of a more sort of distributed chaotic effect here. See how things kind of look? So it almost looks like as these trails sort of go through, they're kind of being wiggled around a little bit by the atmosphere or whatever. So I like that effect too. I just, for whatever reason, didn't turn it on, but it's little tweaks like this you can do to make whatever you're doing completely unique. Here's our friction force. So if we had no friction applied, we would start all our particles would just basically go out at a constant velocity and keep on going. So this friction acts as the air friction, so it sort of slows things down as they fly out from our center point. Pretty simple here, not much to discuss. And then our directional force. So our directional force here, you can see this little arrow, it's pointing down. And that's critical to give an arc to each trails here. So if we move up a few frames, we see things start to arc downwards. If I were to take off that directional force, things are just always going to shoot out in the same direction. So this might be good for a star field or something like that, but in our case we do need a bit of gravity. There we go. Okay, so that's what our force is. And for the directional force, I have this set up to affect just set 1 as well. So I have all this camera and render nodes here. I'm not going to discuss this too much. I have this covered in my Fusion Basics playlist. And we're over here to post. So post, we have a bit of glow. So let me just turn everything on right now. Okay, so I have everything turned on. I've gone back to 600 of these outside trails. So this is sort of the full fireworks. And click on glow. I'll just turn this on and off just to sort of see what the effect it has. So we're going to keep that on. Directional blur. So one of the reasons I use directional blur, one of the problems I actually had is we sort of zoom in. You can kind of see almost between frames as these particles are dropped off, there's these little gaps. So what I did is I just turned on directional blur and it sort of smooths those out a little bit. And I wanted directional blur to fall off over time, and there's a very specific reason for that. Because if you look here, if I bring up the spline editor, my directional blur is sort of completely gone by frame 150 or so. And the reason I did that is because the directional blur is going to be working from this center point and pushing it out. So I don't want it to be blurring this, for example, because it's going to kind of smear things this way. So there we go. I just temporarily kind of cranked up the blur value, and you can see that it's not blurring along the line of the trajectory of each of the trails. It's blurring this way, and that's not something I really wanted. So that's why I use the directional blur for the early phases when things are for the most part pointing out with respect to the origin, and not so much when they start to fall off. I have a little bit of camera shake that I put in, and I've animated these a little bit just to give a little bit of realism. And then finally I just added a little bit of film grain here. So that's pretty much it. So I wanted to talk about a couple of things that I think I might try to do a little bit better next time. So one of the things I didn't do with this video was connect the shell trails with this animation here. So those are completely independent. And if you were to look at those two Fusion compositions, the camera scaling is a little bit off, so you kind of have to sort of fix that a little bit. So for the purpose of this tutorial, I've just rendered two separate clips and sort of jammed them together. And that's the shell trail as well as this explosion here. Ultimately, it would be nice to sort of tie those up so you can have the shell trail and the explosion all in one composition. But this composition here is based on, it starts at sort of frame 0, and if I were to bring that shell trail in, well, I'd have to offset everything till sort of the end of the shell trail. So it would add a little bit more complexity, but it would probably also be a little more versatile as well. Another thing I didn't really like is sort of the uniformity as I was talking about. So I'll set up my reference frame on the right here, and then what we have here. I think they both look pretty good, but this one just looks a little more uniform. And finally, one of the things that I got to figure out how to do, if I were to look back sort of in early frames and I turn off that directional blur, and you can sort of see sort of between particles. So the faster you set your velocity, the bigger these gaps are going to be. So there's got to be a way, I'm sure there is, I just don't know it yet, is to sort of interpolate sort of between these spaces here to sort of smear this out a little more intelligently. In this case, I'm using a directional blur as kind of a hack to get around that or to hide that a little bit, but I think there's probably a bit of a more effective way that I could do that. So that's all I have for today. Thanks so much for checking this out, and I'll talk to y'all later.